March the 15th, 1944. Over the iron skies of Western Germany, 26,000 feet above a world scarred by war, silver bombers crawled across the heavens like slow-moving fortresses. The sunlight caught their wings, turning them into mirrors of steel and hope. Below them, the land was a patchwork of smoke and ruin, the echoes of artillery faint even at this height. And guarding those bombers, flying in tight formation, were men inside machines that had once been mocked. They called them Thunderbolts, thick-bodied, ungainly, and far too heavy for elegance. The Germans had laughed at them, but the men who flew them knew what their planes could do. They were the shield between the bombers and death. They were the storm. Above the storm, the P-47 Thunderbolt was unlike any fighter before it. With its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, it was a beast of raw power and steel. It could dive faster than any aircraft in the sky, shrug off hits that would shatter other planes, and carry 8 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, enough firepower to shred anything in its path. Yet its size deceived many. Luftwaffe aces sneered at it, calling it the flying milk jug, too clumsy to fight their sleek Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. But on that cold March morning, laughter had no place in the frozen air. The bombers needed protection, and the Thunderbolts were there to deliver it. Their engines roared like distant thunder, a sound both comforting and dreadful. Among them flew Captain Robert Bob Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's Wolfpack, a man hardened by months of combat. His hands gripped the throttle as his eyes scanned the endless horizon. The sky was calm, deceptively calm, until the radio crackled with a voice that made every pilot tense. Bandits. 11 o'clock high. It was the call that turned calm to chaos. Dark specks appeared against the sun. German WW190s diving fast, confident in their superiority. Johnson's heart pounded as the first tracers cut the air. He rolled his Thunderbolt into the dive, feeling the G-force press him deep into the seat. The battle had begun. The air turned alive with fire. Tracers streaked past like comets, engines screamed, and the deep thunder of machine guns filled the heavens. Johnson's Thunderbolt trembled under the force of its own guns, 8 streams of molten lead tearing through the sky. He caught a flash of gray, a German fighter breaking apart, its smoke trailing into the clouds below. The cockpit smelled of oil and sweat, the air thick with static and adrenaline. Every second stretched into eternity. The Thunderbolt, once called too heavy to fight, moved with violent grace. It didn't need to turn sharply. It needed only to strike once, and hard. When the sky finally cleared, silence returned, heavy, hollow, and filled with ghosts. The smoke trails faded, the horizon once again endless and cold. Only 3 Thunderbolts made it back to base that day, but the Luftwaffe had lost 10 of its own. The numbers told a quiet truth. The era of the German hunter was ending, and the reign of the American juggernaut had begun. Those who mocked the Thunderbolt now spoke its name with unease. They had seen what 8 .50 calibers could do when wielded by men who refused to break. The joke had turned into judgment. From that day on, the Thunderbolt was no longer a curiosity. It was a legend in the making. Its pilots flew through fire, through the black clouds of flak and the glittering trails of death, to guard the bombers that carried the weight of freedom itself. The P-47 would go on to change the skies of Europe, rewriting the balance of air power. It became more than metal, more than design. It became a symbol of endurance, a flying fortress for those who dared to challenge fate. And in the burning skies of 1944, it proved one truth the enemy would never forget. Sometimes, the slowest storm brings the loudest thunder. In 1942, the air war over Europe was a slaughterhouse of steel and fire. The German Luftwaffe ruled the skies with ruthless precision. Their Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s carving through Allied bombers like hawks among pigeons. Every daylight raid cost lives, aircraft, and hope. American crews called it flying the meat grinder, and for good reason. Few missions ended without loss. The early escort fighters, light and limited, simply couldn't keep up. The bombers were left exposed, helpless once their fuel-short escorts turned for home. The sky had become a battlefield the Allies couldn't win. Something had to change, and fast. Across the Atlantic, in the heart of America's industrial might, a handful of engineers at Republic Aviation were working against time and doubt. Their creation, still on paper, was unlike anything the world had seen. Massive, armored, unapologetically heavy. At its core sat the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, a 2,000 horsepower monster that drank fuel like a furnace. Critics said it was madness. A fighter this big could never compete with the nimble German machines. But men like Alexander Kartveli, the chief designer, believed power was a weapon of its own. The Thunderbolt would not dance. It would endure, strike, and survive. It was not built to flee. It was built to finish. When the first prototypes took to the air in early 1941, the doubts grew louder. Pilots complained it climbed too slowly, burned too much fuel, and handled like a brick with wings. The British, practical as always, dismissed it entirely. Yet behind those clumsy beginnings was a promise: altitude, armor, and unmatched dive speed. Test pilots reported that once the P-47 found its rhythm, it could outdive anything alive. It could take bullets to the wings, shells through the fuselage, and still make it home. The world didn't yet know it, but a juggernaut had just left the ground. Meanwhile, Europe was burning. From Stalingrad to the Channel Coast, the war had become a storm of attrition. In 1943, the U.S. 8th Air Force intensified its daylight bombing campaign, determined to crush the Reich's industry from above. Thousands of young men climbed into B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, trusting their lives to thin aluminum and untested strategy. The Luftwaffe met them head-on with waves of interceptors, and the sky turned red with fire. The call went out across the Atlantic. America needed a guardian, a fighter that could fly high, fight hard, and come back alive. The P-47 Thunderbolt was the answer that arrived just in time. Built in the factories of Farmingdale, New York, it was rolled out in numbers that dwarfed imagination. Mechanics worked through the night, engineers refined the design, and soon the airfields of England began to fill with these enormous fighters. To the bomber crews who saw them for the first time, they looked like angels of steel, thick-bodied, rugged, painted in dull olive green with shark teeth and squadron markings. They were not graceful, but they were dependable. The men who flew them would soon learn that the Jug might not turn like a Spitfire, but it could take punishment no other aircraft could endure. Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke, leader of the 56th Fighter Group, saw the Thunderbolt's potential when others doubted it. Under his command, pilots were trained not to fight like duelists, but like hunters. They learned to use altitude, to dive with speed, to strike and vanish before the enemy could react. Zemke's Wolfpack became the crucible where the Thunderbolt's legend was forged. Their tactics turned the Jug's weight into an advantage, using gravity itself as a weapon. It was an art of war that blended power with patience, courage with calculation. The Allied command understood that air superiority wasn't just about who could fly faster, it was about who could stay alive longer. The Thunderbolt's thick armor gave pilots a chance to return home, to fight another day, in the cold arithmetic of war that mattered more than elegance. German aces might win duels, but America could build 10 planes for every one they lost. The P-47 became the embodiment of industrial warfare, a machine born not of beauty, but of necessity. Its very existence was proof that America's factories could outlast the Reich's arrogance. By mid-1943, as production soared, Thunderbolts began to appear over occupied Europe. Their presence was unmistakable: roaring engines, broad wings, and the distinctive whistle of compressed air through turbo supercharger. German pilots laughed at first, calling them clumsy and oversized, but that laughter masked unease. The Jug could take hits that would obliterate a Bf-109. It could dive away from pursuit at terrifying speed, vanish into cloud, then reappear with guns blazing. The tide was beginning to turn, though few yet realized. In the hangars of England, mechanics covered in oil and frost worked around the clock, patching bullet holes and replacing engines. Pilots drank black coffee, wrote letters home, and prepared for another day in the sky. They were young, tired, and uncertain, but their faith in the Thunderbolt was growing. The plane that once struggled to gain respect was becoming a brother in arms, a symbol of survival in a war that spared no one. Each mission brought lessons written in smoke and courage. Each return flight, no matter how damaged, was proof of its power. In those early months, the P-47 wasn't just a fighter, it was a message. It told the world that the era of Allied weakness in the air was over. For the first time, German pilots looked up and saw something that refused to fall. The sky, once their kingdom, was now contested. The men in the Thunderbolts didn't know it yet, but they were flying the aircraft that would break the Luftwaffe's spine. The storm was coming, heavy, relentless, and forged in American steel. And its name was Thunderbolt. As 1943 bled into 1944, the air war entered a new phase of ferocity. The Thunderbolt squadrons, now fully operational, took to the skies daily, escorting bombers deep into enemy territory. Every mission was a gamble between life and gravity. Pilots learned to trust their aircraft as they trusted their own instincts. The Jug could absorb punishment that would rip others apart. Its thick armor plating often returned pocked with holes, but the engine still roared on. Over France and the Low Countries, the Luftwaffe's confidence began to waver. Their sleek fighters could climb faster, but they could not outlast the relentless storm of 50-caliber fire the Thunderbolts unleashed. Slowly, the laughter that once filled German briefings turned into caution, then silence. The hunters were becoming the hunted. Back home, the legend of the Thunderbolt grew with every returning pilot. Newspapers called it the flying tank, and factory workers painted small lightning bolts on each finished fuselage, as if blessing them for war. The plane had become more than a machine. It was a symbol of American resolve. Every rivet, every panel, carried the fingerprints of men and women who labored tirelessly in hangars lit by the dim glow of welding sparks. The roar of the R-2800 engine was the heartbeat of that effort, echoing across 2 continents. As more squadrons received their Jugs, the Allies began to feel something they hadn't in years: control. The skies were still deadly, but now they were no longer German skies. They belonged to those who dared to rise through the clouds and never look back. In the cold dawn of an English airfield, engines coughed to life beneath a grey sky streaked with contrail. Ground crews moved like shadows through the mist, tightening bolts, loading belts of ammunition, and checking every rivet on the hulking Thunderbolts that stood like beasts waiting for release. Pilots walked toward their planes, helmets tucked under their arms, their breath misting in the chill air. They were young, most barely in their 20s, yet their eyes carried the weight of old men. Each mission meant crossing a threshold between life and memory. They spoke little, their words lost beneath the roar of turbines. Somewhere beyond the channel, the enemy was waiting, and so was destiny. The 56th Fighter Group, under Colonel Hubert Zemke, had become the spearhead of the Allied air war. Zemke drilled his men not for beauty, but for survival. Hit hard, climb fast, dive out, he told them, a creed written in oil and smoke. He knew the Thunderbolt's strengths, its power, its speed in the dive, its unmatched toughness. His pilots trained to strike from above like thunder and vanish before the enemy could react. The Germans still believed in turning dogfights, elegant spirals of death, but Zemke's men had no time for elegance. They fought like storms, brief, violent, unstoppable, and when they returned home, their planes bore scars like badges of honor. Day after day, the missions grew longer and deeper into enemy territory. The bombers needed protection beyond the Rhine, and the P-47s were pushed to their limits. Some pilots ran out of fuel before crossing back over the channel, gliding over the waves and praying for a glimpse of the English coast. Others never returned. The Luftwaffe's aces, men like Erich Hartmann and Günter Rall, still stalked the skies with deadly precision. But even they began to notice something unsettling. The Thunderbolts didn't fall easily. They came back battered, but breathing, leaking oil yet roaring home. A new kind of resilience was rising, one the Germans couldn't match. Between missions, the airfields were graveyards of twisted metal and hope. Mechanics worked through nights lit by lantern, repairing wings torn by flak and patching bullet holes with cold fingers. Pilots slept in their flight suits, waking to the sound of engines they couldn't rest from. Letters from home smelled faintly of dust and perfume, reminders of a world that felt unreal. Every takeoff was a silent promise to return, and every return felt like defiance. The men were not chasing glory, They were chasing survival, and in their hearts, they carried the echo of the Thunderbolt's roar, a sound that meant they were still alive. By early 1944, the tides of war began to shift. Allied bombers struck deeper into the heart of Germany, Leipzig, Frankfurt, and Berlin itself. The Luftwaffe scrambled everything it had, desperate to stop the waves of destruction. It was in these skies that the Thunderbolt came into its own. Pilots had learned every quirk, every vibration of their machines. They trusted its armor, its dive, its guns. When the enemy appeared, they no longer feared the odds. The P-47, once mocked for its size, now struck terror from above. It was not just a plane. It was a hammer of vengeance, swung by men who had forgotten how to yield. And yet, fear never left them. Beneath every flight mask was a heartbeat that remembered friends who never came back. The empty bunks in the barracks, the names scratched on hangar walls, the silence after debriefings. These were reminders that even thunder could fade. But for every man lost, another took his place, fueled by determination and the belief that this machine, this ungainly monster, could change the war. They no longer flew to prove the Thunderbolt's worth. They flew because it had become part of them. The line between man and machine blurred in the roar of battle. As winter melted into spring, the missions intensified. New variants of the Thunderbolt, like the P-47D, carried larger fuel tanks and could escort bombers farther than ever before. The dream of reaching Berlin under fighter cover was becoming reality. The Luftwaffe's dominance cracked under the weight of attrition. Their best pilots were gone, replaced by boys barely trained. But still they came, wave after wave, desperate and fearless. The Thunderbolts met them with the same resolve. In those frozen skies, courage was measured not in victory, but in endurance. Each sortie felt like walking the edge of a blade. Pilots took off in the dim morning light, not knowing if they'd ever see the sun set again. Their engines roared like prayers into the clouds. The air war had become a war of exhaustion, machine against machine, will against will. But through it all, the Thunderbolt endured. It was not elegant, it was not graceful, but it was unstoppable. And in that brutal simplicity lay its genius. The storm was almost ready to break, and when it did, it would shake the Reich to its core. The morning briefings became rituals of courage. Inside the dimly lit rooms, cigarette smoke curled through the stale air as officers traced routes on large maps pinned to the wall. Red lines stretched deep into Germany, targets like Hanover, Kassel, and Münster. The room always fell silent when the losses were read aloud. Names were spoken softly, as if volume could summon them back. The men listened, nodded, and then walked out to their aircraft with quiet resolve. There was no grand speech, no music, only the rhythm of boots on cold ground and the distant growl of engines waiting to ignite. Every takeoff was a leap into the unknown, every mission another test of fate. The Thunderbolts stood in neat rows, their metal skins gleaming like cold mirrors of determination. As spring winds swept across Europe, the Allied air strategy evolved into something relentless. No longer content with defense, the Thunderbolts began hunting. They strafed airfields, convoys, and rail lines, ripping through the arteries of the Reich. It was total war from the clouds, a storm that showed no mercy. The German pilots, once masters of the air, found themselves fighting exhaustion and dwindling resources. Fuel was scarce, replacements inexperienced, and the once proud Luftwaffe bled with every passing day. Yet still, the Thunderbolt pilots pressed on. Each mission carried the same heavy silence before takeoff, the same prayers whispered beneath oxygen masks. They were not chasing victory anymore. They were chasing an ending, one written in smoke, steel, and the unyielding echo of thunder. The morning of February 20th, 1944, dawned grey and bitterly cold over the English countryside. Frost clung to the wings of the waiting Thunderbolts, and the air smelled of oil, gunmetal, and nerves. Operation Argument, the big week, was about to begin. For the first time, Allied bombers would strike deep into the industrial heart of Germany, targeting aircraft factories and rail networks. The Luftwaffe would throw everything it had into the defense. As pilots strapped in, no one needed reminding of the stakes. If the bombers fell, the dream of daylight bombing would die with them. Engines roared to life, shaking the ground. One by one, the Thunderbolts rolled down the icy runway and vanished into the pale horizon. High above the clouds, the formation stretched for miles, a moving fortress of silver wings glinting in the weak sun. The radio crackled with static and code words. The pilots of the 56th Fighter Group climbed to their escort altitude, scanning the empty blue that would soon fill with enemies. In the distance, black puffs of flak burst like dying stars, marking the path ahead. Captain Bob Johnson, his hands steady on the throttle, breathed slowly behind his mask. He had flown countless missions, but this one felt different. There was something in the air, a heaviness, a sense that history was waiting just beyond the clouds. "Bandits 12 o'clock high," came the call, and then the sky erupted. Out of the sun came the Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109, sleek, deadly, and determined. Their yellow noses flashed as they dove through the bomber formations, cannons spitting flame. The Thunderbolts broke formation to intercept, diving like meteors. The air was alive with sound, engines screaming, guns hammering, explosions echoing across the sky. Johnson banked hard, a 190 slicing past his wingtip, close enough to see the German pilot's goggles flash in the light. He rolled, leveled, and squeezed the trigger. The 8 Brownings roared, their tracers carving golden arcs through the haze. The German fighter shuddered, then vanished in a blossom of smoke and fire. Everywhere, chaos reigned. Thunderbolts and Luftwaffe fighters twisted through the air like battling gods. Bombers burned in the distance, their crews parachuting through falling debris. Johnson's radio filled with voices, warnings, shouts, silence. He felt his plane shake violently as bullets tore through the fuselage. The canopy cracked. Oil sprayed across the windshield, blurring the world into streaks of gray. But the engine held. The Jug would not die easily. He pulled the stick, climbing through the smoke until the horizon returned. The altimeter spun wildly. Below him, the battlefield was a living storm. Fire, metal, and courage entwined. At 30,000 feet, the fight reached its peak. The Germans came in waves, disciplined and furious, but the Thunderbolts met them head-on. Their superior dive speed turned gravity into a weapon. One moment, a German ace would be on their tail. The next, the Jug would drop like a stone, vanishing from sight only to reappear behind its pursuer. Zemke's tactics were working. Hit fast, hit hard, disappear. The Luftwaffe began to falter. Their formation scattered, coordination lost. The air was thick with smoke and fragments of aircraft tumbling toward the earth. The Thunderbolts pressed their advantage, relentless as a storm unleashed. On the ground, farmers and soldiers alike looked up and saw the sky aflame. Trails of black smoke crisscrossed the heavens, a dark tapestry of destruction. From below, it seemed as if the gods themselves were at war. The rumble of engines rolled across the countryside like thunder over mountains. One by one, crippled aircraft fell, their flames reflected in the rivers below. To the Germans on the ground, it was a terrifying sight. The empire of the air that once protected them now turned into a graveyard of metal and ash. The myth of Luftwaffe invincibility was dying before their eyes. By noon, the battle had stretched over hundreds of miles. The bombers had reached their targets, Regensburg, Schweinfurt, and Gotha, leaving behind a trail of burning factories and shattered airfields. Above them, the Thunderbolts continued to fight, their fuel dwindling, their ammunition almost gone. Yet still they held the line. Johnson's voice cracked through the radio, hoarse but calm. "Wolfpack, we're heading home." Behind him, the surviving Jugs turned west, smoke trailing from their engine. Their wings scarred but unbroken. They had done what no one thought possible. They had faced the Luftwaffe at full strength and survived. When they landed back in England, the airfield was silent at first. Mechanics rushed forward, counting the returning planes, their faces pale with disbelief. The men climbed out, exhausted, streaked with oil and blood. Some wept quietly. Others simply sat on the tarmac, staring into the clouds they had just conquered. Reports soon confirmed the scale of the victory. Dozens of German fighters destroyed, minimal losses on the Allied side. The Thunderbolt had spoken, and the message was clear. The sky no longer belonged to the Reich. It belonged to the storm that refused to yield. In the weeks that followed, the Thunderbolt's reputation spread like wildfire. German pilots began to fear its silhouette, knowing that once the Jug appeared above them, Escape was almost impossible. They called it Der Koloss, the Colossus. Stories circulated of Thunderbolts returning home, riddled with hundreds of bullet holes, their pilots grinning behind cracked canopies. The machine had proven itself not just as a weapon, but as a survivor. It was the embodiment of the men who flew it, determined, unbreakable, forged by fire. The laughter was gone now. In its place was respect and fear. The victories of the air were only the beginning. By mid-1944, the Thunderbolt found a new calling, not just as a guardian of bombers, but as a destroyer of the ground below. Fitted with bombs and rockets, the Jug became the hammer that shattered the German war machine from above. Columns of tanks, convoys, and supply trains vanished beneath its fire. From Normandy to the Ardennes, its roar announced ruin before the first explosion fell. Pilots dove from the clouds, unleashed their payloads, and pulled up through pillars of smoke, the earth glowing orange beneath them. Villagers hiding in the ruins spoke of the thunder that never stopped. The Luftwaffe could no longer answer. Its wings were broken. The Thunderbolt had become the sky's executioner, striking with precision and fury. Every mission carried a different kind of danger now. The pilots flew low, beneath the flak, through storms of steel that turned the horizon into hell. They watched friends vanish in bursts of fire, their final words lost in static. But still they came back, engines coughing, wings shredded, hearts unbroken. The Jug's thick armor saved lives again and again, earning it a reputation as the plane that brought its men home. German soldiers whispered that it could not be killed. Even the earth trembled when it descended. Each day, the Thunderbolts flew closer to victory, paving the road for armies that would march into the ruins of the Reich. What began as a weapon of doubt had become the sound of Allied triumph, loud, relentless, and unforgettable. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the skies over Europe belonged to ghosts and heroes. The Thunderbolt squadrons returned to their airfields, their aircraft scarred but still standing. Some bore names painted by trembling hands. Sweet Lorraine, the Widowmaker, Lucky 7. Each carried stories that would never reach paper. The men who once roared through flak-filled skies now sat quietly on wooden crates, staring at the empty runways where echoes of war still lingered. In hangars smelling of oil and victory, they cleaned their pistols one last time, unsure if peace could ever replace purpose. For those who survived, the silence was the hardest part. The Jug had carried them through hell, and now it rested beside them, engines cooling, wings folded, mission complete. Across the Atlantic, the legend of the P-47 grew even larger than life. Historians called it the plane that won the ground war, a juggernaut that reshaped air strategy forever. Over 500,000 sorties, more than 3,700 enemy aircraft destroyed, tens of thousands of armored vehicles and trains obliterated. But beyond the statistics was something deeper, the bond between man and machine. The Thunderbolt had been more than a fighter. It was a guardian, a friend, a thunderous promise that no soldier would be left unprotected below. In museums and air shows decades later, veterans would run their hands along its cold metal again, eyes misting with memory. For them, it wasn't just aluminum and steel. It was youth, courage, and the sound of freedom echoing through the clouds. Time moved on, but echoes of that thunder never faded. In the decades that followed, jet engines replaced propellers, and the world traded its heroes for headlines. Yet somewhere in the heart of history, the sound of a radial engine still hums. It's the echo of men who fought not for glory, but for the man flying beside them. The sky, once filled with fire and smoke, became a canvas of memory. The names of the fallen drifted like clouds, never forgotten, always near. Every monument, every rusted hangar, still carries their whispers. For the few who remember, the war was not just fought on maps or in books. It was fought in the endless blue, where courage met destiny and thunder answered fear. Even now, when a restored Thunderbolt rises into the air, all eyes look up. Its roar breaks the silence like a ghost calling through time. Veterans close their eyes and smile, hearing once again the heartbeat of their youth. The world around them has changed, but in that sound, raw, proud, eternal, history breathes again. The Jug remains a reminder that strength is not in perfection, but in endurance. That bravery is not the absence of fear, but the will to rise above it. And that freedom, once earned, must always be guarded. In the silence after the engine fades, one truth still lingers in the wind. Thunder never truly dies. This is WW2 Revisited, where history lives again.